Marcus Chen, heir to a tech empire, encounters Henry, an elderly white janitor, during his lowest moment at Princeton. Failing his final exams despite having everything money could buy, Marcus never knew that this humble man mopping floors had once been a renowned professor who lost everything, and that Henry's simple act of offering encouragement would unlock a secret that no amount of wealth could purchase. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. Marcus Chen had never wanted for anything, yet he felt perpetually empty. In the marble-floored study of his family's Manhattan penthouse, he sat across from Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, his fifth private tutor in 2 years, watching her perfectly manicured fingers tap impatiently against her leather portfolio. The woman commanded $500 per hour, held 3 degrees from Harvard, and spoke 4 languages fluently. She was, according to his father's assistant, the best money could buy. "Marcus, you're not listening again." "Doctor," Hartwell said, her voice carrying the familiar edge of frustrated professionalism. "This is basic calculus. You should have mastered these concepts months ago." He stared past her toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, where the city sprawled endlessly below, a glittering maze of ambition and achievement that felt as foreign to him as ancient hieroglyphs. Somewhere down there, people were working, striving, finding meaning in their daily struggles. Marcus envied them their purpose. The equations on the page blurred together like meaningless scratches. Numbers had always felt abstract to him, disconnected from any real purpose or passion. His father, James Chen, had built a technology empire worth $8 billion through innovation and determination. But somehow, that drive had skipped a generation. Marcus possessed all the resources for success, but none of the hunger. "Perhaps we should try a different approach, Doctor," Hartwell suggested, though her tone suggested she had exhausted her patience along with her repertoire of teaching methods. She was the latest in a succession of elite tutors, each more credentialed than the last, each ultimately defeated by Marcus's apparent inability to care about anything beyond his immediate comfort. His bedroom contained every possible luxury a 18-year-old could desire: the latest gaming systems, a collection of vintage guitars he'd never learned to play, shelves lined with leather-bound books that remained unopened. The irony wasn't lost on him that he owned more books than most libraries, yet had never been moved by a single story. The housekeeper, Maria, appeared in the doorway carrying a silver tray with his afternoon snack: artisanal crackers, imported cheese, and sparkling water in crystal glasses. She smiled warmly at him, the same gentle expression she'd worn since he was small, but even her maternal kindness couldn't penetrate the growing sense of purposelessness that had settled over him like fog. His father would return from Hong Kong next week, expecting progress reports, test scores, evidence that his substantial investment in Marcus's education was yielding dividends. Instead, Marcus would offer the same hollow explanations, the same promises to try harder, the same disappointing results, wrapped in expensive packaging. "Doctor," Hartwell closed her portfolio with a decisive snap. "I'll speak with your father about adjusting our approach," she said, though they both knew she was preparing her resignation. Like the others before her, she had discovered that privilege without passion was impossible to teach. As she gathered her materials, Marcus wondered if there was something fundamentally broken inside him, some essential component of ambition or curiosity that money couldn't purchase. He had everything yet understood nothing, possessed all advantages, yet felt completely lost. Princeton University welcomed Marcus with all the pageantry reserved for legacy admissions whose families had donated entire buildings. His dormitory suite in Blair Arch came furnished with antiques and overlooked the manicured lawns where generations of America's elite had walked before him. Yet within weeks, the prestigious surroundings only amplified his sense of not belonging. His roommate, David Kim from Ohio, possessed the kind of genuine intellectual curiosity that Marcus had always envied. David would stay up until 3 in the morning reading philosophy texts for pleasure. engaging in heated debates about ethics and metaphysics with anyone who would listen. He came from a middle-class family who had scraped together every dollar for his education, and he treated each lecture like a precious gift. Marcus, meanwhile, struggled through his courses despite having access to resources his classmates could only dream of. His father had quietly arranged for private study sessions with graduate students, purchased him every recommended textbook in multiple editions, and even hired a former admissions officer to help optimize his study schedule. Yet the harder he tried to force understanding, the more elusive it became. In Professor Williams's organic chemistry class, Marcus sat in the back row watching his classmates scribble notes with genuine engagement, while the molecular structures on the whiteboard looked like alien hieroglyphs to him. He'd hired Sarah, a doctoral candidate, to tutor him 3 times per week at $200 per session, but even she seemed baffled by his inability to grasp concepts that others found intuitive. "It's like you're memorizing vocabulary in a foreign language without understanding the grammar," Sarah had told him during their last session, frustration creeping into her usually patient voice. "Knowledge isn't just about accumulating facts, Marcus. It's about making connections, seeing patterns, understanding why things work the way they do." But Marcus couldn't see the patterns. The information felt disconnected from anything real or meaningful in his life. When Professor Martinez discussed the economic theories that shaped modern society, Marcus dutifully copied down every word, yet felt no spark of recognition or relevance. These weren't ideas that could change the world, they were simply obstacles between him and graduation. His isolation deepened during study groups where his classmates would debate concepts with passionate intensity. They seemed to possess some internal compass that guided them toward understanding. While Marcus felt like he was wandering through an intellectual wilderness without a map, he would contribute expensive coffee and catered meals to these sessions, hoping his generosity might somehow compensate for his lack of genuine insight. Late at night, while David worked through problem sets with focused determination, Marcus would lie awake, wondering if his admission to Princeton had been purchased rather than earned. The weight of his father's expectations pressed down on him like a physical burden. James Chen had conquered impossible challenges through sheer force of will and brilliant strategic thinking, but Marcus couldn't even master freshman-level coursework. The campus around him buzzed with intellectual energy and ambitious dreams. Yet he moved through it all like a ghost, present in body but absent in spirit. His expensive clothes and casual references to exotic vacations marked him as different, but not in the way he longed to be. He wanted to be different because of his ideas, his passion, his contribution to the vibrant academic community surrounding him. Instead, he was simply another wealthy student drifting through an education he couldn't appreciate, surrounded by resources he couldn't properly utilize. Feeling more alone than he ever had in his life, the Firestone Library stood nearly empty at 2:30 in the morning, its grand reading rooms echoing with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the distant whisper of heating vents. Marcus sat surrounded by a fortress of textbooks, empty energy drink cans, and crumpled sheets of paper that bore witness to his latest academic failure. His economics midterm was in 6 hours, and despite 3 weeks of preparation with his expensive tutor, the concepts remained as incomprehensible as ancient Sanskrit. He stared at a page about supply and demand curves until the lines blurred together, his eyes burning from exhaustion and frustration. The numbers and graphs seemed to mock him, representing not just economic principles, but his own fundamental inadequacy. Around him, the scattered remnants of his study session told a story of desperation. Highlighters in 5 different colors, index cards covered in meaningless abbreviations, and a voice recorder he'd used to repeat key terms until they became meaningless sounds. "I'm pathetic," he whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking with the weight of accumulated disappointment. He'd always known he was different from his brilliant father, but facing concrete evidence of his intellectual limitations felt like staring into an abyss of personal failure. That's when he heard the gentle squeak of wheels approaching. An elderly man emerged from behind the towering bookshelves, pushing a janitor's cart loaded with cleaning supplies and waste bags. He wore a simple grey uniform, with Henry embroidered on the breast pocket, and moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had long ago made peace with being invisible to the world around him. Henry's weathered hands guided the cart with practiced efficiency, but his eyes held a warmth that seemed out of place in the sterile academic environment. When he noticed Marcus hunched over his books like a wounded animal, he paused in his methodical cleaning routine. "Rough night, son?" Henry asked softly, his voice carrying the gentle cadence of someone who understood struggle intimately. Marcus looked up, surprised to find genuine concern in the older man's expression. Most people saw his expensive clothes and assumed his life was effortlessly perfect. But Henry seemed to recognize the universal language of academic despair. "Economics midterm in a few hours," Marcus replied, his voice hollow with defeat. "I've been studying for weeks, but it's like my brain is made of concrete. Nothing sticks." Henry nodded thoughtfully, continuing his quiet work as he spoke. "Been there myself. Long time ago. Sometimes the harder we try to force understanding, the more elusive it becomes, like trying to catch water with your bare hands." The simple metaphor struck Marcus more powerfully than any of his tutor's complex explanations. There was something profound in Henry's gentle observation, a wisdom that seemed to emerge from lived experience rather than academic theory. "You mind if I ask? What's giving you the most trouble?" Henry inquired, emptying a nearby trash can with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. Marcus gestured helplessly at his scattered notes.
"All of it."
"Supply curves, market equilibrium, consumer behavior. It's supposed to explain how people make decisions, but it feels completely disconnected from real life." Henry's eyes sparkled with something that might have been recognition. "Real life, you say? That's interesting. Most folks think economics is just about numbers and graphs, but it's really about people and their stories." As Henry continued his cleaning, moving with unhurried purpose through the cavernous library, Marcus found himself watching this humble man with newfound curiosity. There was something different about him, something that suggested depths beneath his simple exterior that Marcus was only beginning to glimpse. Henry finished wiping down a nearby table with methodical care, his movements reflecting decades of practiced routine. Yet there was something almost meditative in the way he worked, as if he found genuine satisfaction in bringing order to the world around him. Marcus watched, fascinated despite his exhaustion, as this gentleman transformed chaos into cleanliness with quiet dignity. "You know," Henry said, folding his cleaning cloth with precise corners, "I've seen a lot of students over the years, sitting right where you're sitting now. Same look of frustration, same piles of books, same feeling like they're drowning in information they can't quite grasp." Marcus leaned back in his chair, grateful for any distraction from his incomprehensible textbooks. Did any of them figure it out? The ones who stopped trying so hard to memorize everything and started trying to understand why it mattered. Henry replied, pushing his cart closer. "There's a difference between knowing something and understanding it. Knowledge is like having a key, but understanding is knowing which door it opens and why you'd want to go through it." The distinction resonated with Marcus in a way that surprised him. All his expensive tutoring had focused on accumulation, memorizing formulas, repeating definitions, cramming facts into his reluctant brain, but Henry was suggesting something entirely different. "Take your economics there," Henry continued, nodding toward Marcus's scattered notes. "You're trying to memorize supply and demand curves like they're ancient spells. But those curves represent real people making real decisions every single day. The woman choosing between name brand and generic cereal because her budget's tight. The farmer deciding how much corn to plant based on last year's prices. The teenager saving up for concert tickets and weighing whether it's worth eating ramen for a month." Marcus stared at his textbook with new eyes. The abstract graphs suddenly seemed less like mathematical torture devices and more like attempts to map human behavior. "I never thought about it that way." "Most people don't, at first," Henry said kindly. "We get so caught up in the mechanics that we forget about the humanity underneath. But here's the secret. Once you start seeing the people behind the principles, everything else starts making sense." He pulled an old rag from his cart and began polishing the brass handle of a nearby door, his movements slow and contemplative. "I remember struggling with Shakespeare in school. couldn't make heads or tails of all that fancy language. Then one day, instead of trying to decode every word, I started listening for the emotions underneath. Suddenly, Hamlet wasn't just a bunch of confusing speeches. He was a young man trying to figure out right from wrong in an impossible situation. Marcus found himself hanging on every word. There was something profoundly different about Henry's approach to learning, something that felt more human and accessible than anything his expensive tutors had offered. This wasn't about intellectual superiority or academic performance, it was about connection and meaning. "But how do I do that with economics?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious for perhaps the first time in months. "How do I see the people behind the graphs?" Henry's weathered face creased into a gentle smile. "Start by asking different questions. Instead of, 'What does this curve show?' try asking, 'Why would someone make this choice?' Instead of, 'How do I calculate equilibrium?' ask, 'What happens to real families when these numbers shift?'" The simplicity of the suggestion was revolutionary to Marcus. All his academic life had been spent answering other people's questions in predetermined ways. Henry was suggesting he could ask his own questions, seek his own understanding, find his own path through the labyrinth of knowledge. "You make it sound so simple," Marcus said, though without the bitterness he might have felt toward his expensive tutors. "Simple doesn't mean easy," Henry replied with quiet wisdom. "But it means possible." Over the following nights, Marcus found himself returning to the library not just to study, but to witness Henry's quiet transformation of the academic space around him. What had initially seemed like simple janitorial work revealed itself to be something far more profound, a nightly ritual of care and restoration that Marcus had never bothered to notice before. Henry arrived each evening at precisely 10 o'clock, hanging his worn jacket on a hook behind the circulation desk. With the same careful attention he gave everything else. He would survey the day's accumulated chaos, abandoned coffee cups, scattered papers, overflowing trash bins, not with resignation but with the calm assessment of someone who understood his purpose completely. Marcus watched from his usual corner table as Henry methodically worked through each section of the library. There was no hurried efficiency in his movements, no shortcuts or half measures. He wiped down every table surface until it gleamed, straightened every chair to perfect alignment, and replaced each book that careless students had left behind exactly where it belonged. His work wasn't just cleaning. It was an act of restoration, returning order and dignity to a space dedicated to learning. What struck Marcus most profoundly was Henry's relationship with the space itself. While students like Marcus saw the library as a backdrop for their academic struggles, Henry seemed to understand it as something sacred. He handled the leather-bound volumes with reverence, adjusted reading lamps to optimal angles, and ensured that every study carrel was prepared for the next day's seekers of knowledge. During quiet moments, Marcus observed Henry pausing at bookshelves, his weathered fingers tracing spines with unmistakable familiarity. These weren't the casual glances of someone simply organizing inventory. They were the gentle touches of someone who knew these books intimately, who understood their contents and their value in ways that transcended their monetary worth. One evening, Marcus noticed Henry carefully repairing a torn page in an economics textbook that some careless student had damaged. Using a small bottle of archival glue and steady hands, Henry mended the paper with surgical precision, taking far more time than his job description required. When he finished, he held the book up to the light to ensure the repair was invisible, then placed it back on the shelf with satisfaction. "Why do you do that?" Marcus asked quietly, breaking their comfortable pattern of parallel existence in the late-night library. Henry looked up from his cart, unsurprised by the question. These books contain decades of human thinking, centuries of accumulated wisdom. Someone spent years writing each one, hoping to share something important with the world. Seems disrespectful to let that knowledge deteriorate just because someone was careless with it. The explanation revealed something essential about Henry's character that Marcus found both humbling and inspiring. Here was a man whose official job description probably included nothing about book conservation, yet he took personal responsibility for preserving the intellectual treasures around him. His work ethic wasn't driven by ambition or recognition, No one would ever know about his careful repairs or extra attention to detail, but by an internal compass that demanded excellence regardless of external rewards. Marcus began to understand that Henry's dignity didn't come from his position or possessions, but from his unwavering commitment to doing meaningful work with complete integrity. Every night, Henry transformed the library from a place of scattered confusion into a sanctuary of organized possibility, preparing it for the next day's students who would never know his name but would benefit from his care. Watching Henry work became Marcus's inadvertent education in character, showing him what it looked like when someone found genuine purpose in service to something larger than themselves. As the nights passed, Marcus began to notice how Henry's conversations carried layers of meaning beneath their surface simplicity. The older man never lectured or preached, but his casual observations seemed to contain profound truths that Marcus found himself pondering long after their brief exchanges ended. Funny thing about this job, Henry mentioned one evening while organizing scattered periodicals with methodical precision. Most people think I'm just pushing a mop around, but I'm actually preparing a stage. Every clean table, every straightened chair, every properly shelved book, they're all setting the scene for someone's breakthrough moment. Marcus looked up from his calculus homework, intrigued by the theatrical metaphor. You really think about it that way? Henry paused in his work, holding a worn copy of Plato's Republic with unexpected tenderness. Had a professor once who told me that the smallest actions can have the largest consequences. Never forgot that. Sometimes the difference between a student giving up and pushing through is whether they can find a clean, quiet space to think. Makes my work feel pretty important when you look at it that way. The concept resonated deeply with Marcus, who had always been taught to measure success in grand gestures and major achievements. His father spoke in terms of market dominance and revolutionary innovations, while Henry found profound meaning in ensuring optimal lighting conditions for late-night studiers. But doesn't it ever feel? Marcus struggled to find words that wouldn't sound condescending. I mean, don't you want to do something bigger? Henry's weathered hands continued their careful work as he considered the question. Depends on how you define big, I suppose. Last month, I noticed a young woman, economics major like yourself, who came in every night, looking more defeated than the last. Her notebooks were a mess, papers scattered everywhere, clearly drowning in information she couldn't organize. He moved to the next shelf, his voice taking on a storyteller's rhythm, so I started leaving little things for her. A fresh pencil, where her old one had worn down to nothing. A small lamp positioned just right to reduce the glare on her textbook. One night, I reorganized some scattered handouts I found at her usual table, put them in chronological order based on her professor's syllabus. Marcus found himself leaning forward, drawn into the narrative. Did it help? 2 weeks later, she was explaining supply chain theory to 3 other students. Confident as you please, Henry replied with quiet satisfaction. She never knew I'd done anything, probably thought she'd just gotten better organized on her own, but I knew that sometimes the smallest nudge in the right direction can change everything. The story revealed something revolutionary to Marcus, about the nature of impact and importance. While he had been raised to believe that meaningful work required recognition, titles, and measurable outcomes, Henry had discovered profound fulfillment in anonymous acts of service that created ripple effects he would never receive credit for. There's a satisfaction in helping someone succeed without them even knowing you were there, Henry continued, dusting off a reading lamp with gentle attention. Like being a guardian angel, except instead of wings, you've got a mop and a keen eye for what people need. Marcus began to understand that Henry's approach to service wasn't about martyrdom or self-sacrifice, but about recognizing the interconnectedness of human experience. Every clean surface, every properly arranged study space, every small act of consideration was an investment in someone else's potential success. I never thought about work that way, Marcus admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. Henry smiled with the warmth of someone who had discovered a secret worth sharing. Most people don't, at first. We're taught to think about what we can get from our work. Money, recognition, advancement. But there's something powerful about asking what our work can give to others. Marcus's curiosity about Henry began to extend far beyond their late-night library encounters. What had started as casual conversations about studying techniques evolved into something deeper when Marcus realized that Henry's seemingly simple observations often contained sophisticated insights that his expensive tutors had never articulated. "Henry," Marcus ventured one evening as the older man carefully arranged reference materials on a cart. "You mentioned economic theory the other night. Like you'd actually studied it. Where did you learn so much about supply and demand?" Henry's hands paused for just a moment in their methodical work, and Marcus caught something flickering across his weathered features, not discomfort. Exactly, but a complex emotion that suggested layers of untold story. "Oh, you pick things up over the years," Henry replied with characteristic understatement. 43 years in academic environments. You hear a lot of lectures through thin walls. Overhear countless study groups. He read books that students leave behind. But Marcus had begun to recognize the difference between casual knowledge and deep understanding, and Henry's grasp of complex concepts clearly fell into the latter category. When he had explained market equilibrium using the metaphor of a river finding its natural course, the analogy had been too precise, too insightful to come from passive absorption. "That explanation you gave me about behavioral economics last week," Marcus pressed gently, "about how people don't actually make rational decisions the way traditional models suggest. That wasn't something you overheard. You understood the fundamental critique of classical economic theory." Henry straightened slowly, his expression growing thoughtful as he weighed how much to reveal. "I suppose I've always been curious about why people do what they do. Economics tries to predict human behavior, but humans are beautifully unpredictable creatures. We make decisions based on emotions, memories, hopes, fears, all the things that numbers and graphs can't quite capture." Marcus found himself genuinely engaged in intellectual discussion for the first time in months. "So you think the mathematical models are wrong?" "Not wrong," Henry corrected with gentle precision. "Incomplete. They're useful tools for understanding general patterns, but they can't account for the grandmother who spends her last $20 on birthday presents for her grandchildren instead of groceries for herself. The models call that irrational behavior. But anyone who's ever loved someone knows it's the most rational thing in the world." The sophistication of Henry's thinking astounded Marcus. His professors presented economic theories as established facts to be memorized, but Henry approached them as ongoing conversations about human nature that deserved questioning, refinement, and personal reflection. "You've read Kahneman, haven't you?" Marcus asked, referring to the Nobel Prize-winning behavioral economist whose work on cognitive biases had revolutionized the field. Henry's eyes sparked with unmistakable recognition. "Fascinating work on prospect theory. The idea that people feel losses more intensely than equivalent gains explains so much about seemingly irrational market behavior. Though I always thought his research on happiness and life satisfaction was even more profound." Marcus stared at the man before him with growing amazement. Henry wasn't just familiar with cutting-edge economic research. He was engaging with it at a level that surpassed most of Marcus's classmates, and possibly some of his professors. "How do you know all this?" Marcus asked with genuine wonder. "I mean, really know it, not just surface-level familiarity." Henry resumed his quiet work, but Marcus could sense him wrestling with some internal decision. "Knowledge is like water, son. It finds a way to flow wherever there's thirst for it. Doesn't matter much where you encounter it: classroom, library, life experience. What matters is whether you're truly listening." The non-answer was itself revealing, suggesting depths of personal history that Henry wasn't ready to share. But Marcus no longer saw the man before him as simply a janitor who happened to be wise. He was beginning to suspect that Henry's presence in this library, his profound understanding of academic subjects, and his gentle guidance represented something far more complex and intentional than mere coincidence. The truth emerged on a cold February evening when Marcus discovered Henry sitting alone in the philosophy section, holding a leather-bound volume of Aristotle's Ethics with trembling hands. The book fell open to a page marked with decades-old annotations written in Henry's unmistakable handwriting. And Marcus realized he was witnessing a deeply private moment of remembrance. Henry looked up with eyes that held 30 years of accumulated grief. And for the first time, his carefully maintained composure cracked. "I used to teach," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a confession he had never intended to make. "Professor Henry Morrison, Department of Philosophy and Economics, University of Chicago. Published 3 books, tenure track, corner office overlooking the quad. Had a beautiful wife named Eleanor, who believed in my work, and a daughter, Sarah, who wanted to be just like her daddy when she grew up." His weathered fingers traced the familiar text as memories flooded back unbidden. "But academic politics are brutal, Marcus. When you challenge established thinking, when you question the theories that built other professors' careers, you make enemies. I published research suggesting that traditional economic models were fundamentally flawed because they ignored human psychology and moral reasoning. The department chair saw it as an attack on everything he'd spent his career defending." Henry's voice grew distant as he recalled the systematic campaign that destroyed his academic life's stolen research credit, falsified peer reviews, whispered allegations of academic misconduct that were impossible to disprove. "They made my life so miserable that I started drinking to cope." Eleanor tried to help, but I was drowning in bitterness and self-pity. "One night, I came home drunk and angry, and I said things to her that I can never take back. She left the next morning, took Sarah with her, and I never saw either of them again." The final blow came when his department used his personal struggles as justification to deny him tenure, effectively ending his academic career and leaving him unemployable in his field. 23 years later, he had found peace in honest work and quiet service, but the brilliant mind that had once challenged economic orthodoxy now cleaned the very libraries where his former colleagues' books still sat on the shelves. Testament to a life that could have been, the revelation of Henry's past transformed their nightly conversations into something resembling graduate seminars, with Marcus eagerly absorbing lessons that no amount of money could have purchased. "The problem with your education, son," Henry explained while methodically organizing returned books, "is that you've been taught to learn for external rewards, grades, approval, future wealth, but genuine understanding comes from internal curiosity, from asking questions, because you genuinely want to know the answers." He paused in his work to face Marcus directly, his eyes holding the intensity of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. "When I was teaching, I could always identify students who were intrinsically motivated versus those studying for external validation. The intrinsically motivated ones would stay after class not because they needed better grades, but because an idea had sparked something inside them that demanded exploration." Henry pulled a worn economics textbook from a nearby shelf, one that Marcus recognized from his own frustrated study sessions. "You've been approaching this material like it's a foreign language you need to memorize for a test. But economics is actually the study of human choices and their consequences. Every graph represents millions of real decisions made by real people trying to create better lives for themselves and their families." He opened to a chapter on market failures, pointing to concepts that had previously seemed abstract and meaningless to Marcus. Instead of asking, "What will be on the exam?" try asking, "Why do people make choices that seem to hurt them? What prevents markets from distributing resources fairly? How might we design systems that better serve human flourishing?" The shift in perspective was revolutionary for Marcus, who had spent his entire academic career focused on performance rather than understanding. Henry continued, "Curiosity isn't something you can manufacture or purchase. It arises naturally when you stop trying to impress others and start trying to understand the world around you. When you read about income inequality, don't just memorize the statistics, wonder about the families behind those numbers. When you study supply chains, think about the workers whose labor creates the products you use daily." As Henry spoke, Marcus felt something awakening within him that he had never experienced before, a genuine desire to know more. Not for grades or approval, but because the questions themselves had become fascinating. For the first time in his academic life, learning felt like an adventure rather than an obligation. Marcus approached his next economics assignment with Henry's voice echoing in his mind, replacing his usual panicked memorization with genuine questions about human behavior. Instead of frantically highlighting every sentence in his textbook, he found himself wondering why certain communities remain trapped in cycles of poverty, despite government assistance programs, and what psychological factors might prevent people from making financially optimal decisions. When Professor Martinez assigned an essay on market externalities, Marcus didn't immediately reach for his expensive tutor's contact information. Instead, he walked through Princeton's surrounding neighborhoods, observing how industrial pollution affected different communities and asking himself why environmental costs seemed to fall disproportionately on the poorest residents. The questions that emerged felt personal and urgent rather than academic and abstract. For the first time, he began connecting economic theories to real-world situations he could observe and understand. His study sessions transformed from desperate cramming marathons into focused investigations driven by his own curiosity. When he encountered concepts about labor economics, he found himself thinking about Maria, his family's housekeeper, and wondering about the economic forces that determined her wages and working conditions. The abstract became personal, and the personal became fascinating. His grades began to improve incrementally, not dramatically, but consistently. More importantly, he started participating in class discussions, offering perspectives that emerged from genuine reflection rather than rehearsed answers. Professor Martinez noticed the change, commenting after one particularly insightful contribution about behavioral economics that Marcus seemed to have found his intellectual voice. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete, but Marcus could feel something fundamental shifting in his relationship with learning. Knowledge was no longer something imposed from outside that he had to force into his reluctant brain. It was becoming something he actively pursued because the questions themselves had become irresistible. Henry's method of connecting abstract concepts to human stories was working, slowly but surely awakening the intellectual curiosity that had been dormant beneath years of privileged educational experiences that had taught him everything except how to actually think. The shift in Marcus's academic fortunes didn't go unnoticed by his classmates, particularly when they observed him engaged in animated conversations with Henry during late-night library sessions. Bradley Whitman, whose family's pharmaceutical fortune made even the Chens seem modest, was the first to comment with his characteristic blend of arrogance and disdain. "Seriously, Marcus? You're getting study tips from the cleaning guy?" he remarked loudly during a group study session, his voice carrying across the hushed reading room with deliberate intent to embarrass. "I mean, I know you've been struggling, but asking the janitor for academic advice? That's a new low, even for you." The other students within earshot began to snicker, their privileged sensibilities offended by the idea that wisdom could come from someone whose uniform bore a service company's logo rather than an Ivy League crest. Jessica Crawford, whose senator father had secured her admission through carefully orchestrated donations, joined the mockery with cruel precision. "What's next, Marcus? Life coaching from the cafeteria workers? Career guidance from the groundskeepers? Maybe the bathroom attendants have some insights about molecular biology?" Their laughter felt like physical blows to Marcus, who had spent his entire life navigating the complex social hierarchies of wealth and status that governed his world. He understood their contempt perfectly. They saw Henry's humble position as evidence of intellectual inferiority, unable to conceive that circumstances rather than capabilities might determine someone's professional trajectory. The ridicule stung not just because it was directed at him, but because it revealed the casual cruelty with which his peers dismissed anyone who didn't fit their narrow definitions of worthiness. As Bradley continued his performance for their captive audience, describing Henry as that old guy who probably never even finished high school, Marcus felt a surge of protective anger unlike anything he'd experienced before. These students who had never questioned their inherited advantages, who confused privilege with merit and wealth with wisdom, were mocking the person who had shown him more genuine insight in a few weeks than his expensive tutors had provided in years. The moment crystallized everything wrong with the insular world he had always accepted without question, forcing him to choose between social acceptance and moral integrity. Marcus felt something shift inside him as Bradley's mocking laughter echoed through the reading room, A transformation that went deeper than academic improvement or intellectual curiosity. This was about fundamental human decency and the courage to stand up for what was right. He closed his textbook with deliberate force, the sound sharp enough to cut through the cruel entertainment his classmates were enjoying at Henry's expense, and stood to face them with a steadiness that surprised even himself. "That's enough," he said, his voice carrying an authority that came not from wealth or status, but from genuine conviction. "Henry Morrison isn't just a janitor. He's a former professor of philosophy and economics from the University of Chicago who knows more about the subjects we're struggling with than any of us ever will." The laughter died abruptly as Marcus continued, his words measured but fierce with protective loyalty. "He's published 3 books, held tenure-track positions, and understands human behavior and economic theory at a level that would humble our professors. More importantly, he's shown me more kindness and wisdom in these past weeks than any of you have managed in 4 years of knowing me." Bradley's smirk faltered as Marcus stepped closer, no longer the uncertain, privilege-softened young man who had arrived at Princeton months earlier. "You want to know why I talk to Henry? Because unlike the rest of us, he doesn't measure someone's worth by their bank account or their family name. He sees potential where others see failure, offers help without expecting anything in return, and treats everyone with the dignity and respect that you clearly never learned, despite all your expensive educations." Jessica started to object, but Marcus cut her off with quiet intensity. "Henry has taught me that real intelligence isn't about accumulating credentials or networking connections. It's about asking meaningful questions, understanding the human stories behind abstract concepts, and using knowledge to serve something larger than yourself. While you've been competing to impress professors who'll forget your names the moment you graduate, Henry has been quietly changing lives through small acts of service that will ripple forward in ways he'll never know." The silence that followed felt profound and uncomfortable, charged with the weight of moral challenge that his privileged classmates weren't prepared to face. Marcus realized he no longer cared about their approval or acceptance. He had found something far more valuable in Henry's friendship and guidance, and he would defend both with whatever courage he possessed. That evening, as Henry quietly swept the area where Marcus had defended him hours earlier, the weight of accumulated wisdom finally crystallized into the simple truth that would change everything. "You stood up for me today," Henry said without looking up from his work, his voice carrying deep gratitude, mixed with something that sounded like pride. Word travels fast in a place like this, especially when privilege finally develops a conscience. Marcus felt his cheeks flush, unsure how Henry had learned about the confrontation, but grateful that his mentor seemed pleased rather than embarrassed by the attention. "They were wrong about you, Henry. Everything they said was wrong." Henry paused in his sweeping, leaning on his broom handle, with the contemplative posture of someone preparing to share a profound insight. "But here's what I want you to understand, son. The reason you were able to defend me, the reason your grades are improving, the reason you're finally connecting with your studies isn't because you've gotten smarter or developed better study techniques." He fixed Marcus with eyes that held decades of hard-won understanding. "It's because you've learned to care about someone other than yourself. That's the secret that no amount of money can buy and no expensive tutor can teach. Genuine learning happens when we stop asking, 'What can this knowledge do for me?' and start asking, 'How can this knowledge help me serve others?'" The revelation hit Marcus like a lightning bolt of recognition, illuminating patterns he had sensed but never fully understood. "When you started caring about my dignity, you discovered your own courage. When you began wondering about the real people behind economic statistics, those abstract theories suddenly made perfect sense. When you stopped studying just to pass tests and started learning to understand the world's problems, your mind opened in ways you never thought possible." Henry's voice grew warm with the satisfaction of a teacher watching his student grasp the most important lesson. Education isn't about accumulating knowledge for personal advancement. It's about developing the wisdom and compassion to make the world better for everyone. The moment you shifted from self-centered learning to other-centered understanding, everything else followed naturally. That's why your father, despite all his success, never found fulfillment in pure achievement, and why you felt empty despite having every advantage, because knowledge without compassion is just sophisticated selfishness. As the truth settled over Marcus like dawn breaking across a landscape, he was seeing clearly for the first time. He understood that Henry hadn't just taught him study techniques or academic concepts, he had revealed the fundamental purpose of education itself. The transformation in Marcus's approach became evident the very next week when he noticed Sarah Kim, David's younger sister who had enrolled mid-semester, struggling with the same organic chemistry concepts that had once tormented him. Instead of feeling superior about his hard-won understanding or viewing her difficulties as an opportunity to boost his own standing in Professor Williams's class, Marcus found himself genuinely concerned about her obvious distress during lab sessions. He approached her after class with the same gentle curiosity that Henry had shown him, asking not, "Do you need help?" which might have wounded her pride, but, "Would you like to study together?" I found some approaches that really helped me connect the molecular structures to real-world applications. Sarah's grateful acceptance marked the beginning of what became Marcus's new educational and philosophy, learning through teaching and growing through service to others. He began organizing informal study groups that focused not on competition for the highest grades, but on ensuring that everyone understood the material well enough to apply it meaningfully. When Jessica Crawford struggled with economic game theory despite her aggressive competitiveness, Marcus patiently walked her through prisoner's dilemma scenarios, using examples from everyday cooperation and conflict, helping her see the human psychology underlying mathematical models. Even Bradley Whitman, who had initially resisted Marcus's overtures as condescending charity, eventually found himself grateful for Marcus's insights into behavioral economics, particularly when Marcus framed complex concepts in terms of market psychology that connected to Bradley's family's pharmaceutical business. The remarkable discovery was that teaching others deepened Marcus's own understanding, exponentially explaining supply chain vulnerabilities to struggling classmates, forced him to think more clearly about economic interconnections than any individual study session ever had. His professors began to notice not just his improved performance, but his collaborative spirit and his ability to articulate complex ideas in accessible ways that helped entire classes grasp difficult concepts. Marcus realized that Henry's secret was creating a virtuous cycle. Caring about others' learning enhanced his own understanding, which made him more capable of helping others, which further enriched his comprehension and sense of purpose. The competitive isolation that had characterized his entire educational experience melted away, replaced by a collaborative approach that made learning feel like a shared adventure rather than a zero-sum game where others' success threatened his own. Marcus arrived at the library on a Thursday evening in late March to find Henry's cleaning cart abandoned in the main corridor, its contents scattered in a way that spoke of sudden emergency rather than careful organization. The night supervisor, Mrs. Patterson, approached him with grave concern etched across her weathered features, explaining that Henry had collapsed during his shift and been rushed to Princeton Medical Center after experiencing what appeared to be a heart attack. The news hit Marcus like a physical blow, sending him reeling with the sudden realization of how much his life had come to depend on Henry's quiet presence and gentle guidance. Over the past months, their nightly conversations had become the anchor of his existence, the source of wisdom and purpose that had transformed him from a directionless heir into someone discovering his own capacity for meaningful thought and compassionate action. The sterile hospital corridors felt like a nightmare as Marcus navigated toward the cardiac intensive care unit, his mind racing with fears about losing the man who had become far more than a mentor. Henry had become the father figure he had always needed, but never found in his own ambitious, emotionally distant parent. When he finally reached Henry's bedside, the sight of this dignified man reduced to tubes and monitors broke something inside Marcus that he hadn't known was fragile. Henry's weathered hands, which had guided cleaning equipment with such graceful precision and held beloved books with such reverence, now lay motionless against white hospital sheets, and Marcus felt the crushing weight of mortality pressing against everything he had taken for granted. The doctors spoke in measured tones about arterial blockages and surgical procedures, but Marcus heard only the terrible possibility that Henry might never return to their library sanctuary, never again offer the quiet wisdom that had awakened Marcus's sleeping intellect and dormant conscience. As he sat beside Henry's unconscious form through the long night hours, Marcus grappled with the terrifying prospect of continuing his journey of growth and discovery without the gentle guidance that had made it possible, wondering if he was strong enough to honor Henry's lessons without Henry himself to encourage and correct his stumbling progress toward becoming a better human being. The next morning found Marcus making phone calls with the focused determination of someone who had finally discovered what truly mattered, beginning with his father's personal physician to ensure Henry received the best possible cardiac care regardless of his insurance limitations. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, surprised by her son's unprecedented display of genuine concern for another person's welfare, agreed to quietly arrange for Henry's transfer to Mount Sinai's cardiac unit in New York, where the family's substantial donations guaranteed access to the most advanced treatment available. Marcus then called his family's lawyer to establish a medical trust fund that would cover not only Henry's immediate surgical needs, but also his long-term recovery and rehabilitation, structuring it carefully to preserve Henry's dignity by presenting it as a Princeton University staff benefit rather than personal charity. He spent hours researching cardiac rehabilitation programs, consulting with specialists, and coordinating with social services to ensure Henry would have comprehensive support throughout his recovery process. When visiting hours resumed, Marcus brought Henry's beloved books to the hospital room, reading aloud from Aristotle's ethics and behavioral economics texts, hoping that familiar voices and cherished ideas might somehow reach his mentor even in unconsciousness. He organized rotating visits from library staff and even some of the students Henry had quietly helped over the years, creating a network of care that honored Henry's impact on the Princeton community. Most remarkably, Marcus reached out to Eleanor and Sarah Morrison, tracking them down through careful investigation and heartfelt persistence, explaining how profoundly Henry had changed his life and asking if they might consider reconciling with a man who had spent decades earning the wisdom to deserve their forgiveness. The process of advocating for Henry's care taught Marcus lessons about responsibility, compassion, and effective action that no classroom could have provided, transforming him from a passive recipient of privilege into an active agent of positive change. As he coordinated medical appointments, insurance paperwork, and emotional support networks, Marcus realized that Henry's greatest gift hadn't been academic guidance, but the example of how to use whatever resources you possess in service of others' well-being. The scared, directionless boy who had arrived at Princeton was gone, replaced by a young man who understood that true strength came from the courage to care deeply and act decisively when someone you love needed help. As final exams loomed 3 weeks after Henry's surgery, Marcus faced the ultimate test not just of his academic knowledge, but of whether he could apply Henry's transformative lessons under the intense pressure that had historically paralyzed him with anxiety and self-doubt. Sitting in the economics examination room with 2 hours to analyze market failures in healthcare systems, Marcus felt the familiar surge of panic beginning to rise. But instead of surrendering to it, he heard Henry's gentle voice reminding him to ask different questions and seek the human stories behind abstract theories. Rather than frantically trying to recall memorized formulas and textbook definitions, Marcus closed his eyes and thought about Henry lying in that hospital bed, about the insurance complications they had navigated, about the stark differences between the care available to wealthy patients versus those without connections or resources. The exam question about healthcare market inefficiencies suddenly transformed from an academic exercise into a deeply personal exploration of issues he had witnessed firsthand, and his pen began moving with confidence as he wrote about information asymmetries between doctors and patients, the moral hazard created by third-party payment systems, and the tragic consequences of treating healthcare as a commodity rather than a human right. When faced with complex calculations about supply elasticity, Marcus didn't panic about forgotten formulas, but instead visualized the real-world scenarios. These numbers represented farmers responding to crop price fluctuations, consumers adjusting their behavior during economic downturns, small businesses adapting to changing market conditions. Henry's teaching about connecting abstract concepts to human experiences allowed Marcus to work through problems intuitively, using logic and empathy to understand economic relationships even when he couldn't remember specific mathematical procedures. Most importantly, when confronted with essay questions about policy recommendations, Marcus found himself writing not about what would maximize GDP or corporate profits, but about what would create more humane and just economic systems that served human flourishing rather than merely efficient resource allocation. As he handed in his exam with genuine confidence for the first time in his academic career, Marcus realized that Henry's greatest gift hadn't been study techniques or subject knowledge, but a fundamental shift in perspective that made learning feel meaningful, purposeful, and connected to his deepest values about how people should treat one another. 2 weeks later, Marcus stared at his final grades with a mixture of disbelief and profound gratitude, seeing not just passing marks but evidence of genuine intellectual transformation that went far beyond what any expensive tutor had ever achieved. His economics grade wasn't just a B+, it was accompanied by Professor Martinez's handwritten note praising his remarkable evolution from mechanical regurgitation to sophisticated analytical thinking that demonstrates both technical competence and genuine insight into the human dimensions of economic policy. His organic chemistry grade reflected not perfect memorization of molecular structures, but his newfound ability to understand the underlying principles that governed chemical interactions, allowing him to solve problems through logical reasoning rather than rote formula application. Most significantly, his philosophy of ethics course, an elective he had chosen specifically to honor Henry's influence, earned him an A-, along with Professor Williams's comment that his final paper on economic justice and moral responsibility showed mature thinking that connects abstract philosophical principles to contemporary social challenges with unusual depth and authenticity. For the first time in his academic career, Marcus felt that his grades actually reflected his understanding rather than his father's financial investment in his education. The transformation was visible to everyone around him. David Kim commented on how Marcus had become the student others sought out for study group leadership, not because he had the best grades, but because he could explain difficult concepts in ways that made them meaningful and accessible. Sarah Kim, whose chemistry struggles Marcus had patiently guided throughout the semester, sent him a heartfelt message crediting his teaching approach with saving her pre-med dreams and helping her discover a genuine passion for molecular biology. Even Bradley Whitman grudgingly acknowledged that Marcus had become actually smart instead of just wealthy. A backhanded compliment that nevertheless represented significant recognition from someone who measured worth primarily in terms of intellectual superiority. As Marcus reflected on his academic turnaround, he understood that the real achievement wasn't the improved grades, but the discovery that learning could be joyful, meaningful, and connected to his deepest values about service and human dignity. Henry's wisdom had unlocked not just academic success, but a fundamental shift in how Marcus approached knowledge as a tool for understanding and helping others, rather than merely advancing his own prospects in life. Graduation day arrived with the kind of golden Princeton spring that seemed designed for pomp and circumstance. But Marcus felt only one presence missing from the sea of proud families gathered on the historic campus: Henry, who remained in rehabilitation but had sent a carefully handwritten note expressing profound pride in Marcus's transformation and academic achievements. 3 months of recovery had restored Henry's physical strength, though doctors warned that returning to the physical demands of janitorial work might be inadvisable, leaving the older man facing an uncertain future that weighed heavily on Marcus's mind as he accepted his diploma with genuine satisfaction rather than hollow relief. The celebration dinner at his family's estate became the setting for the most important conversation of Marcus's life, as he formally presented his father with a proposal that had been months in the making. The creation of an educational initiative within the Chen Foundation focused on mentorship programs that connected wisdom with opportunity, regardless of traditional credentials or social status. "I want Henry Morrison to direct this program," Marcus announced with the quiet confidence that had replaced his former uncertainty, explaining how a former professor working as a janitor possessed exactly the kind of insight needed to identify and nurture overlooked potential in students who didn't fit conventional academic molds. James Chen, who had watched his son's remarkable transformation with growing respect and bewilderment, listened as Marcus outlined a vision for educational reform that emphasized character development, critical thinking, and social responsibility alongside traditional academic achievement. The foundation position would offer Henry not just financial security and meaningful work, but the opportunity to return to his true calling of teaching and mentoring, albeit in an unconventional setting that valued wisdom over credentials and impact over prestige. When Marcus visited Henry's modest apartment to make the offer in person, he found his mentor surrounded by beloved books and looking remarkably like the professor he had once been, dignity restored along with his health. "You don't owe me anything, son," Henry protested with characteristic humility. But Marcus interrupted with gentle firmness. "This isn't about debt or gratitude. Henry, this is about creating something meaningful together, a place where students like I used to be can discover what you taught me, that real education happens when we learn to care about something larger than ourselves." As Henry's weathered hands trembled slightly while holding the formal offer letter, Marcus realized that this moment represented not just career advancement, but the closing of a circle that had begun with a young man's academic failure and culminated in a shared mission to transform how education could serve human flourishing. 5 years later, Marcus stood before the board of Chen Technologies as its newly appointed CEO, presenting the company's annual impact report that measured success not just in billions of dollars earned, but in millions of lives improved through educational initiatives, ethical business practices, and sustainable innovation programs that had become the corporation's defining legacy. The Chen Foundation's educational mentorship initiative, now operating in 47 states under Henry's visionary leadership, had revolutionized how society understood the relationship between wisdom and credentials, proving that transformative teaching could emerge from the most unexpected sources. Former janitors, retired factory workers, recovering addicts, and wise grandmothers whose life experiences contained profound lessons that no university could formally accredit. Henry, now 73, and bearing the title of Chief Wisdom Officer, with characteristic humor and grace, had become a nationally recognized expert on alternative education models, regularly consulting with universities and corporations about creating more inclusive and effective learning environments that honored the full spectrum of human intelligence and experience. Marcus's own family had grown to include Eleanor, his wife of 2 years, who shared his commitment to using privilege responsibly, and their infant son, Henry Chen, named for the man whose gentle guidance had saved not just one young man's academic career, but had ultimately transformed an entire business empire's approach to success and social responsibility. The transformation rippled far beyond corporate boardrooms and foundation offices, inspiring a new generation of business leaders who understood that sustainable prosperity required companies to serve as stewards of human potential rather than mere extractors of profit, creating economic models that measured worth in terms of dignity preserved, opportunities created, and communities strengthened. Every evening, Marcus would walk through the Foundation's mentorship center, observing pairs of unlikely teachers and eager students engaged in the sacred work of knowledge transmission that transcended traditional hierarchies of education and social status, their conversations echoing with the same gentle wisdom that had once awakened his own sleeping conscience in a quiet library years ago. As he watched Henry moving through these spaces with the serene satisfaction of someone whose life's work had found perfect expression, Marcus reflected on how a chance encounter with a humble janitor had not only saved his academic career, but had revealed the fundamental truth that would guide his entire life, that real wealth was measured not by what you could accumulate for yourself, but by what you could awaken in others, and that the most profound education happened when wisdom flowed freely between souls who recognized their shared humanity, despite the artificial barriers that society constructed to keep them apart.